At 33 years old, Martha Hale stood with nowhere left to belong after the creditors of the Carson Mining Company seized her family's small homestead to satisfy debts her late father had never truly owed, and with only $7 silver wrapped inside a faded handkerchief tucked into her worn leather satchel, she accepted ownership of an abandoned blacksmith forge on the forgotten edge of the frontier town of Briar Ridge when the council simply gave it to her, rather than waste money tearing it down. A decision nearly everyone regarded with pity because the soot-blackened building had stood empty for almost 20 years, yet sealed deep inside its crumbling chimney rested a forgotten document capable of restoring land stolen from honest settlers, healing old divisions, and changing the future of the entire valley before greed erased its history forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Martha Hale. If you're watching from a place that has ever felt forgotten by the rest of the world, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, because sometimes the quietest places carry the greatest stories. Martha Hale entered the world during the early years of Briar Ridge, when the little frontier settlement still measured prosperity by the steady rhythm of wagon wheels and the ringing music of hammers striking glowing steel inside the town forge. Her father, Jonathan Hale, was not the town blacksmith, though many strangers mistakenly believed he was, because he spent nearly every evening helping repair broken tools after finishing his own work in the surrounding timber camps. Jonathan earned his living cutting cedar and pine high in the western hills, yet he possessed unusual skill with iron, learned from his own father long before the family journeyed west. Whenever axes cracked, wagon rims loosened, horseshoes bent, or plowshares split beneath stubborn prairie soil, Jonathan quietly carried the damaged pieces to the forge after sunset and remained there until every tool became useful again. Martha often accompanied him, sitting on neatly stacked firewood while sparks drifted upward like tiny golden stars, disappearing into the dark chimney above. To a child, the forge felt almost magical. Massive bellows breathed like some sleeping giant, awakening each time the fire needed life. The anvil sang beneath every careful hammer blow. Glowing iron slowly surrendered its stubborn shape beneath patience rather than force. Jonathan never rushed the metal. Iron remembers how it was treated, he often told Martha while turning bright orange steel inside the coals. Strike too hard and it becomes brittle. Strike with care, and it'll carry another family through winter. Martha listened far more than she spoke. She watched her father's weathered hands shape broken things into useful ones, again and again. Bent hinges became straight. Cracked wagon brackets gained new strength. Rust disappeared beneath wire brushes and oil until forgotten tools looked almost new. Long before Martha learned geography or arithmetic, she learned something her father repeated so often it settled quietly into the foundation of her character. Most people see what's broken, Jonathan would say. Good people learn to notice what can still be saved. Her mother, Eleanor Hale, possessed gifts no less valuable. She served as Briar Ridge's unofficial schoolteacher whenever enough children gathered inside the church hall during winter months. She believed reading opened doors no wagon could ever reach and filled their modest cabin with books traded from travelers crossing the territory. Some volumes lacked covers, others missed pages. A few had been repaired so many times their bindings barely held together. Yet Eleanor treasured every one. Each evening after supper she read aloud, while Jonathan quietly sharpened tools beside the fireplace, and Martha listened with wide, attentive eyes. Stories about courage, honesty, perseverance, and forgotten heroes became as familiar to her as birdsong drifting through open windows each spring. The Hale cabin stood beside Willow Creek, where cottonwood trees lined the water's edge, and deer often appeared just before sunrise. Though small, the house never felt poor. Jonathan repaired every loose board before it became dangerous. Eleanor stitched quilts from worn clothing no longer fit for daily work. Martha tended a tiny vegetable garden behind the cabin, while chickens wandered freely beneath the fence. Neighbors visited often, rarely because they needed anything, but because conversation flowed naturally wherever kindness lived. During harsh winters, Jonathan quietly repaired sled runners for families unable to pay. Eleanor taught children whose parents could offer nothing except gratitude. Neither expected reward. They simply believed every frontier town survived because ordinary people chose generosity before comfort. As Martha grew older, Jonathan gradually trusted her with more responsibility inside the forge. He first allowed her to organize nails by size, then polish finished tools, then operate the great leather bellows while he worked heated iron upon the anvil. Eventually, he placed a small hammer into her hands. "Listen before you strike," he instructed gently. Martha looked confused. "Listen to what?" Jonathan smiled toward the glowing steel resting upon the anvil. "The iron tells you when it's ready. Every good craftsman learns that nothing lasting can be forced before its proper time." She discovered he was right. Heated metal carried a rhythm all its own. Too cool, and every strike risked cracking it. Too hot, and it lost its strength. Success depended less upon power than patience. Those quiet evenings shaped Martha far more deeply than either parent realized. She learned to observe carefully before acting. She learned that repairing often demanded greater skill than replacing. She learned that people, like iron, carried unseen histories hidden beneath worn surfaces. Most importantly, she learned that worthwhile work rarely announced itself loudly. The finest repairs often became invisible once finished. Every Saturday afternoon, the forge became the busiest place in Briar Ridge. Ranchers arrived leading horses needing fresh shoes. Farmers waited with wagons loaded full of broken equipment. Teamsters exchanged stories while drinking hot coffee around the fire. Children watched glowing sparks leap upward through the chimney into bright western skies. Martha loved those gatherings because every person entered carrying something damaged and departed carrying hope restored. The blacksmith himself, Elias Turner, treated every visitor with quiet dignity, regardless of wealth or position. A ranch owner paid the same fair price as a struggling widow. Travelers without money often left owing only future kindness. Elias once caught Martha watching him repair a cracked plowshare long after sunset without charging the elderly farmer who owned it. "Your father understands this already," Elias said softly while returning the finished tool. "A forge isn't important because it shapes iron." Martha tilted her head curiously. "Then why is it important?" Elias rested both hands upon the warm anvil. "Because it keeps honest people working." Martha never forgot those words. Years later, they would return with astonishing clarity. Inside the abandoned forge everyone else believed had become useless. Life flowed peacefully through the seasons. Spring filled Willow Creek with wildflowers and melting snow. Summer echoed with hammers striking steel from dawn until dusk. Autumn painted the valley gold beneath endless skies, while families prepared for another frontier winter. During Christmas gatherings, the forge fire often remained burning, simply because weary travelers arriving after dark found comfort seeing warm light waiting for them. Martha believed such ordinary blessings would last forever. Yet beyond the peaceful hills surrounding Briar Ridge, powerful mining companies had begun purchasing enormous tracts of land after surveyors discovered rich silver deposits beneath nearby mountains. Investors arrived, carrying polished boots, expensive coats, and promises of prosperity unlike anything the little settlement had ever known. Many welcomed the newcomers. Jonathan watched more cautiously. One evening, while repairing an old splitting maul beneath the forge roof, he quietly spoke words Martha only partially understood. "Gold and silver aren't dangerous," he said. "People forgetting what mattered before they found them, that's the danger." Martha glanced toward the busy main street, where unfamiliar businessmen laughed confidently outside the hotel. "Will they change the town?" Jonathan rested his hammer beside the anvil before answering. "Every town changes." He looked slowly around the little forge, glowing warmly beneath firelight. "The question is whether it remembers who built it." Those words settled deep within Martha's heart, without her fully realizing it. Years later, when she stood alone inside an abandoned forge blackened by soot and forgotten by nearly everyone who once depended upon it, they would guide every choice she made, just as surely as the steady rhythm of her father's hammer had once guided glowing iron beneath patient hands. As Martha entered her teenage years, nearly everyone in Briar Ridge came to know her as the quiet young woman who could usually be found either carrying books beneath one arm or helping inside the forge after school lessons had ended. She never possessed the loud confidence that often attracted attention, yet people remembered her because she listened before speaking, and because whatever task she accepted was completed with unusual care. Elias Turner, the aging blacksmith, often joked that Martha noticed problems before the tools themselves realized they were broken. He trusted her with responsibilities few apprentices received. She learned how to sort different grades of iron by touch rather than appearance, how to judge the temperature of glowing steel by subtle changes in color, and how to hear the faint difference between a sound piece of metal and one hiding invisible cracks deep inside. "Every material tells the truth," Elias explained while holding a horseshoe against the anvil. "The question is whether we're patient enough to hear it." Jonathan smiled quietly whenever he heard those lessons repeated, because they echoed his own beliefs almost word for word. Neither man realized they were teaching Martha far more than blacksmithing. They were teaching discernment. They were teaching restraint. They were teaching her to search beneath appearances before reaching conclusions. Those habits gradually became part of her character until she practiced them, almost without thinking. Eleanor continued shaping her daughter's mind with equal devotion. The little schoolhouse remained modest, often crowded with children of every age, seated together upon rough pine benches. Yet Eleanor believed learning depended far less upon buildings than curiosity. She encouraged every child to ask difficult questions rather than simply memorizing easy answers. "Books preserve facts," she often reminded Martha after evening lessons. "But wisdom comes from understanding why those facts matter." Whenever travelers passed through Briar Ridge carrying newspapers from larger eastern cities, Eleanor carefully saved them. Though many stories concerned places Martha would likely never visit, they taught her how quickly communities changed whenever wealth arrived faster than wisdom. Railroads expanded. Mining camps appeared almost overnight. Fortunes rose and disappeared with astonishing speed. Yet beneath every headline, Eleanor noticed another story. Ordinary families either flourished together or struggled alone, depending upon whether neighbors remembered their obligations to one another. Those observations quietly settled inside Martha, alongside every lesson learned beneath the forge roof. Spring eventually gave way to another busy summer. The forge worked almost without pause, as wagon trains heading toward distant mining camps stopped for repairs before continuing west. The constant ringing of hammer upon steel echoed from sunrise until darkness settled across the valley. Martha loved those sounds because they represented honest labor rather than hurried ambition. Teamsters spoke gratefully of repaired axles. Farmers proudly carried sharpened plows back toward waiting fields. Ranchers left smiling after stubborn horses finally accepted newly fitted shoes. Every completed repair meant another family could continue building a life somewhere beyond the horizon. One warm evening after the last customer departed, Elias remained standing beside the dying forge fire longer than usual. His broad shoulders, once powerful enough to swing a heavy sledgehammer all day without tiring, now seemed slightly bent beneath invisible weight. Martha noticed him rubbing one wrist before carefully setting his hammer upon the workbench. "Does it hurt?" she asked gently. Elias smiled with quiet honesty. "More than it used to." Jonathan looked up from the wagon bracket he had been repairing. "You've carried this town a long time." Elias chuckled softly. "Long enough to know no one carries anything forever." He turned toward Martha. "Promise me something." She nodded immediately. "If people ever stop believing this place matters." His weathered hand rested affectionately upon the scarred anvil, polished smooth by decades of faithful work. "Don't believe them too quickly." Martha glanced around the familiar building. Smoke-darkened rafters stretched overhead. Every wall carried the marks of years spent shaping iron for countless neighbors. Shelves overflowed with carefully organized tools whose handles had become smooth through generations of use. Nothing about the forge appeared grand, yet everything inside spoke quietly of usefulness. "I couldn't imagine anyone forgetting it," she answered. Elias smiled, though sadness briefly touched his eyes. "Neither could I. Once." Those words lingered with Martha long after the evening ended. Before another year passed, change arrived more quickly than anyone expected. The Carson Mining Company expanded aggressively into the surrounding hills after several exceptionally rich silver veins were discovered north of Briar Ridge. Investors purchased land wherever they could. New businesses appeared almost monthly. Elegant brick offices rose beside simple wooden storefronts that had served the town faithfully since its beginning. Many celebrated the prosperity. Others watched more cautiously. Jonathan belonged firmly among the second group. One evening, he spread several newly printed land notices across the kitchen table after returning from town. Eleanor studied them quietly, while Martha looked over both parents' shoulders. "What's happened?" she asked. Jonathan pointed toward unfamiliar company seals stamped upon nearly every document. "They're buying timber rights along Willow Creek." Eleanor frowned slightly. "That includes the hills behind our cabin." Jonathan nodded. "And most of the grazing land beyond them." Martha looked from one parent to the other. "Can they do that?" Jonathan answered carefully. "Legally? Perhaps." He folded the notices slowly. Whether it's right is another question. Over the following months, pressure upon local families steadily increased. Company representatives visited farms, offering generous payments for land many owners had occupied since the settlement's earliest days. Some accepted gladly, dreaming of easier lives elsewhere. Others refused, believing their homes worth more than money. Jonathan declined every offer politely but firmly. "My father planted these trees," he explained, whenever another representative arrived. "Some things aren't measured by acreage." The visitors usually smiled politely before leaving. Yet each new offer carried greater insistence than the last. Martha gradually noticed another troubling change. Neighbors who once worked together without hesitation now argued over property boundaries, mineral rights, and survey lines that had never before caused disagreement. Long friendships quietly weakened beneath promises of future wealth. The forge remained one of the few places where everyone still gathered regardless of status, because broken tools cared little about politics or profits. Elias often shook his head after particularly tense afternoons. "Iron hasn't changed," he muttered, while shaping another glowing horseshoe. "Only the hands holding it." Jonathan understood exactly what he meant. One crisp autumn evening, as father and daughter walked home beneath brilliant stars, after finishing repairs at the forge, Jonathan paused upon the little bridge crossing Willow Creek. The water flowed gently beneath them, reflecting moonlight between scattered cottonwood leaves drifting downstream. "Remember this place," he said quietly. Martha looked around in mild confusion. "I always will." Jonathan rested both hands upon the worn wooden railing. "Not because it's perfect." He smiled softly toward the peaceful valley stretching beyond the trees. "Remember it, because honest people built it together." Martha nodded, sensing unusual seriousness in his voice. He continued almost as though speaking to himself. "Buildings can disappear. Businesses can fail. Even towns sometimes forget why they began. But if one person remembers the truth, then perhaps it isn't truly lost." Martha could not know those would become among the final lessons her father ever gave her before powerful men, forged deeds, and hidden betrayals scattered everything her family had patiently built. Years later, standing inside an abandoned blacksmith forge everyone else considered worthless, she would remember every word with astonishing clarity and finally understand why Jonathan had spoken them so carefully beside the quiet waters of Willow Creek. Not long after that quiet conversation beside Willow Creek, the changes Jonathan had feared began arriving with startling speed. The Carson Mining Company no longer approached families as polite buyers hoping to purchase land. Instead, they returned carrying surveyors, attorneys, and freshly printed legal notices declaring ownership of timber rights, stream access, and parcels that local families had believed belonged to them for generations. Every week, another neighbor discovered unexpected claims against property once considered unquestionably their own. Confusion slowly replaced certainty. Old boundary markers suddenly no longer matched company maps. Fences that had stood peacefully for decades became sources of bitter disagreement. The valley itself had not changed, yet the papers describing it somehow had. Jonathan refused to surrender to fear. Each morning he continued cutting timber only where long-established agreements allowed. Each evening he repaired broken tools inside the forge beside Elias Turner, exactly as he always had. Truth doesn't stop being true because someone prints different words, he quietly told Martha while sharpening an old crosscut saw. Eventually honest records catch dishonest men. Martha believed him completely. She had no reason not to. Yet powerful people often move faster than truth. One cold November morning, 2 company representatives arrived at the Hale cabin, accompanied by the county recorder. They carried official-looking maps, marked with crisp red boundary lines. According to their documents, the Hale property now occupied land recently transferred to Carson Mining through an unpaid timber contract, supposedly signed several years earlier. Jonathan calmly studied every page before looking up. "I've never signed this agreement." The younger representative smiled without warmth. "The county records indicate otherwise." Jonathan pointed directly toward the signature at the bottom. "That isn't my handwriting." The recorder shifted uncomfortably, but avoided meeting Jonathan's eyes. "If you believe an error has occurred, you're welcome to challenge the filing in court." Jonathan asked one simple question. "When?" "Within 30 days. The representatives departed almost immediately, leaving the folded documents upon the kitchen table. Eleanor examined the signature carefully. "Someone copied your name," she whispered. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Poorly." Martha looked from one parent to the other. "Then we'll win." Jonathan managed a gentle smile meant more to comfort his daughter than express confidence. "We'll certainly try." During the weeks that followed, Jonathan traveled repeatedly to the county seat gathering witnesses, earlier land records, tax receipts, and every document proving the family's rightful ownership. Neighbors willingly testified they had watched Jonathan purchase the property years before. Even Elias Turner accompanied him, prepared to swear beneath oath that Jonathan had occupied the land continuously since the settlement's earliest days. Yet each visit revealed another obstacle. Original survey books had mysteriously disappeared. Clerks claimed older tax ledgers could not be located. Pages seemed missing from official record books. Every honest piece of evidence gradually vanished behind newer documents carrying impressive company seals and carefully forged signatures. Eleanor quietly recognized what Jonathan rarely admitted aloud. "Someone planned this, long before we knew it was happening." Jonathan never argued, because deep inside, he knew she was right. Winter settled heavily across Briar Ridge. Snow-covered fences, rooftops, and frozen fields, while the legal dispute continued with painful slowness. Jonathan exhausted nearly every dollar the family had carefully saved, over 20 years, hiring attorneys willing to challenge Carson Mining's claims. One by one, those lawyers quietly withdrew. Some apologized sincerely, admitting the company possessed influence extending far beyond the courtroom. Others simply stopped returning correspondence altogether. Martha watched her father grow visibly more tired with each passing week, yet he never allowed bitterness to replace kindness. Even while struggling to defend his own home, he continued repairing neighbors' broken tools whenever they appeared at the forge needing help. Elias often shook his head in quiet admiration. "Most men become smaller under pressure," he remarked one snowy evening after Jonathan finished restoring a widow's broken stove door without accepting payment. "You somehow become larger." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Someone has to remind this town who it used to be." The trial finally arrived during the first warm days of spring. Nearly every resident of Briar Ridge crowded inside the small courthouse, believing justice would surely prevail once the forged documents were exposed. Jonathan calmly presented the original tax receipts preserved by Eleanor. Elias testified regarding the family's uninterrupted occupation of the land. Elderly neighbors described helping build the Hale cabin decades earlier. For several hopeful hours, Martha believed the truth had finally begun revealing itself. Then Carson Mining introduced one final witness. A former surveyor unexpectedly claimed he had personally witnessed Jonathan signing the disputed timber contract years before. Martha immediately recognized the man. He had never visited the Hale property in his life. Jonathan recognized him as well, yet the witness spoke with practiced confidence while producing copies of maps no one else had previously seen. By sunset, the judge ruled in favor of Carson Mining, declaring the company's ownership legally established. Jonathan stood quietly as the decision echoed through the crowded courtroom. He neither shouted nor argued. He simply gathered the family's papers with careful hands before thanking the judge respectfully, despite the crushing disappointment settling across the room. Outside the courthouse, several neighbors attempted awkward words of encouragement. Jonathan merely nodded politely. On the long wagon ride home, Martha finally asked the question neither parent had spoken aloud. "What happens now?" Jonathan kept his eyes upon the dusty road stretching ahead. "We continue being honest people." Eleanor reached quietly across the wagon seat and squeezed his hand. "And the cabin?" Jonathan answered after a long silence. Belongs to them now. Within 30 days, company workers arrived carrying eviction notices. They granted the Hale family one afternoon to remove whatever belongings they could transport before assuming possession. Martha packed books, while Eleanor carefully wrapped family photographs inside quilts she had sewn years earlier. Jonathan carried only his father's tools, refusing to leave behind the hammer that had repaired half the valley's equipment over 3 decades. Before closing the cabin door for the final time, he paused beside the stone fireplace where countless peaceful evenings had unfolded. His hand rested gently upon the mantel for several moments. "Take care of her," he whispered so softly, only Martha heard the words. They spent the following weeks living inside a tiny rented room above the general store, while Jonathan searched tirelessly for new work. Mining camps hired younger men willing to accept dangerous conditions for little pay. Timber companies quietly refused his applications after learning of the court dispute. The same powerful interests that seized his property now controlled nearly every opportunity to earn another living. Jonathan never complained. He simply rose before dawn each morning and continued searching. Then, one rainy afternoon, he returned from the mountains, soaked to the bone, after walking nearly 15 miles, seeking employment at a distant logging camp. A fever settled upon him that evening. By morning, he could barely stand. The frontier doctor diagnosed severe pneumonia, complicated by months of exhaustion and relentless strain. Eleanor nursed him constantly while Martha worked wherever she could, washing laundry, mending clothing, sweeping storefronts after closing, but medicine cost money they no longer possessed. Jonathan weakened steadily through the following weeks. One quiet evening, as rain tapped softly against the little attic window above the general store, Martha sat beside his bed, holding the weathered blacksmith's hammer he had insisted she keep nearby. Jonathan smiled faintly, despite obvious pain. "Do you remember what I told you about broken things?" Martha nodded through gathering tears. "Good people notice what can still be saved." He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Never let anyone convince you that people, or places, lose their worth because others stop believing in them." Those became the final words Jonathan Hale ever spoke. He passed peacefully before sunrise, while Eleanor quietly sang one of the old hymns that had filled their cabin throughout Martha's childhood. The little valley seemed strangely silent that morning, as though even the forge itself somehow understood another faithful pair of hands would never again lift a hammer beside its fire. Martha believed losing her home had been the hardest sorrow she would ever endure. She soon discovered grief sometimes arrives in quiet succession, asking ordinary hearts to carry far more than they ever imagined possible. After Jonathan's passing, Briar Ridge no longer felt like the town Martha remembered from childhood. The streets remained the same. The mountains still stood proudly beyond the valley. The old church bell continued ringing every Sunday morning, yet something quieter had disappeared. Neighbors still greeted one another politely, but many now lowered their voices whenever the Carson Mining Company appeared in conversation. Honest people had begun believing that honesty alone no longer protected them. Eleanor noticed it as deeply as Martha did, though she rarely spoke about it. Instead, she accepted whatever work remained available. She taught children whose parents could still afford small tuition, mended clothing by lamplight, copied legal correspondence for the doctor's office, and quietly stretched every penny until there seemed nothing left to stretch. Martha found work wherever she could, repairing fences, cleaning storefronts after closing, hauling supplies for merchants too old to lift heavy crates themselves. Together they survived, but only just. The greatest burden was not hunger, it was uncertainty. Every morning began without knowing whether another day's wages would appear before sunset. Months passed this way, until Eleanor herself began weakening beneath the endless labor. She never complained. She simply grew slower, climbing the narrow stairs leading to their rented room above the general store. Her cough lingered longer each week. Martha urged her to rest, but Eleanor smiled gently. Rest comes after responsibility. Those words sounded painfully familiar. They were exactly what Jonathan would have said. One cool October evening, after finishing another long day sewing shirts for railroad workers, Eleanor quietly laid her needle aside. "Martha," she said softly, "walk with me." They followed the familiar path toward the old blacksmith forge, where Jonathan and Elias had spent so many evenings together. The building no longer rang with the music of hammer upon anvil. Elias Turner had retired nearly 3 years earlier after arthritis finally made swinging the heavy sledge impossible. Since then, the forge had remained locked, abandoned, and slowly surrendered to time. The great chimney still rose proudly above the roof, but broken shutters rattled whenever prairie winds drifted through the valley. Tall weeds surrounded the porch. Rust covered the once polished hinges. Martha stopped several yards away. "I haven't been here since Father—" She could not finish the sentence. Eleanor nodded quietly. "Neither have I." They stood together in silence while autumn leaves gathered against the weathered doorway. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Do you know why your father loved this place?" Martha smiled faintly. "Because it fixed broken things." Eleanor looked toward the soot-blackened chimney reaching into the evening sky. "Not only tools." She rested one gentle hand upon Martha's shoulder. "It repaired hope." Martha looked thoughtfully at the old forge. Even neglected, it somehow carried quiet dignity. Time had scarred the building, yet it refused to collapse. The heavy stone foundation remained solid. The broad timber beams still supported the roof despite years of abandonment. It seemed almost to be waiting patiently for someone willing to believe in it again. "Do you think anyone will ever reopen it?" Martha asked. Eleanor smiled sadly. "Perhaps someone who remembers why it mattered." Those became one of the final peaceful conversations they shared. Winter arrived unusually early that year. Heavy snow buried Briar Ridge beneath weeks of relentless storms. Eleanor's cough steadily worsened despite every remedy the local physician could provide. She continued working until the very day her strength finally failed. One snowy morning, Martha returned from delivering repaired clothing to find her mother sitting quietly beside the little attic window, watching flakes drift across the rooftops. Eleanor smiled warmly as Martha entered. "The valley looks beautiful today." Martha knelt beside her chair. "The doctor is coming again." Eleanor gently shook her head. "No." She reached for Martha's hand. "There's something I want you to remember instead." Martha leaned closer. Eleanor's voice had become little more than a whisper. "Never mistake wealth for worth." Tears filled Martha's eyes. "I won't." Eleanor squeezed her hand gently. "Your father understood that. Elias understood it too. Promise me you'll remember." Martha nodded through silent tears. Eleanor smiled peacefully. Before sunset, she quietly joined Jonathan. Within 2 years, Martha had lost both parents, her childhood home, and nearly every certainty upon which her life had once rested. The funeral drew fewer people than Jonathan's. Many old neighbors had already moved away after selling land to the mining company. Others simply felt too weary from their own struggles to attend, yet Elias Turner appeared, despite walking painfully with the aid of a carved hickory cane. Snow rested upon his shoulders as he stood silently beside the grave. After everyone else departed, he remained. Martha walked beside him through the quiet cemetery. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Elias reached into the pocket of his heavy wool coat and removed a small object wrapped carefully inside soft leather. "Your father wanted you to have this someday." Martha slowly unfolded the leather. Resting inside lay Jonathan's favorite blacksmith's hammer, the same worn tool that had shaped countless wagon rims, hinges, horseshoes, and plowshares over nearly 30 years. The ash handle had grown smooth beneath decades of faithful work. Tiny burn marks still covered one side, where glowing iron had occasionally brushed against it. Martha held it gently, almost afraid to breathe. Elias smiled quietly. "He repaired half this valley with that hammer." Martha looked toward the abandoned forge standing faintly beyond the snowy rooftops. "It belongs there." Elias followed her gaze. "Perhaps someday." His expression became thoughtful. "I've been meaning to tell you something." They stopped beside the frozen creek, where winter sunlight reflected softly across untouched snow. Elias leaned upon his cane. "The town council has argued about that old forge for years." Martha looked surprised. "Why?" "Some want to tear it down." Her heart sank. Elias continued. "Others say repairing it would cost too much." He smiled faintly. "Mostly they can't decide who ought to pay for either." Martha lowered her eyes. "That's unfortunate." Elias looked directly at her. "Last week's meeting ended differently." "How?" "No one wanted the building." Martha frowned slightly. "No one?" Elias shook his head. "It has no commercial value anymore. The mines have their own machine shops now. Blacksmiths order factory-made parts instead of forging everything by hand. He chuckled softly. The council finally said if anyone was foolish enough to take responsibility for the place, they could simply have it. Martha stared at him without speaking. Elias smiled warmly. I thought of your father immediately. Why? Because he'd have accepted before they finished the sentence. Martha laughed quietly for the first time in many months. Elias reached into another pocket and withdrew a folded paper bearing the town seal. Mayor Collins asked me to deliver this personally. Martha unfolded the document. It formally transferred ownership of the abandoned Briar Ridge blacksmith forge to Martha Hale without payment, provided she accepted responsibility for maintaining the structure and preventing its demolition. She looked up in disbelief. They're giving it away? Elias nodded. They believe they're giving you a burden. Martha slowly looked toward the distant forge, standing peacefully beneath fresh snow. Memories flooded back with astonishing clarity. Jonathan patiently shaping glowing iron, Eleanor reading beside warm firelight, while sparks drifted upward through the chimney. Elias teaching her to hear the truth hidden inside metal before striking it. The forge had never merely been a building. It had been the heart of the community long before greed taught the town to measure value differently. Martha folded the deed carefully. I'll take it. Elias smiled broadly. I knew you would. The following morning she carried her father's hammer, a broom, a lantern, and a small toolbox through freshly fallen snow toward the abandoned forge. Several townspeople watched curiously from across the street. One merchant quietly shook his head. Another whispered, "Poor girl. She has nothing left." Martha heard them, yet continued walking. She climbed the weathered porch steps, unlocked the swollen front door with the heavy iron key the mayor had provided, and slowly pushed it open. Cold air carrying the familiar scent of soot, aged timber, burnt coal, and forgotten years drifted gently outward. Sunlight entered through cracked windows, illuminating thousands of floating dust particles dancing beneath the enormous chimney that had once carried the forge's fire into the western sky. Martha stepped inside without hesitation. She rested Jonathan's old hammer gently upon the scarred anvil, exactly where he had laid it countless evenings before. Looking around the silent building, she smiled softly. Let's see what can still be saved. Unseen high above her, deep within the soot-darkened chimney, where no one had looked for nearly 20 years, something long hidden waited patiently for the first honest hands, willing to bring the old forge back to life. Martha spent the first several days restoring the forge without touching a single brick of the great chimney. The roof demanded immediate attention before another storm arrived. Several loose cedar shingles threatened to lift away, with every strong wind sweeping down from the mountains. Window frames had swollen after years of rain and winter snow. The front porch leaned noticeably toward one corner, where a support post had slowly settled into the earth. Every evening she returned to her tiny rented room exhausted, her hands blistered from labor, yet carrying something she had not felt since losing her parents. Purpose. The forge asked nothing from her except honest work, and honest work had always been the language she understood best. By the end of the first week, curious townspeople began slowing their wagons whenever they passed. Some simply watched from a distance, others wandered over pretending to admire the weather before asking cautious questions. "You really mean to keep this place?" one rancher asked. "I do." "What for?" Martha smiled while tightening another porch brace. "To keep it standing." The man chuckled politely. "It hasn't earned $1 in 20 years." Martha continued working without looking up. "Not everything valuable earns money." The rancher said nothing further, though he removed his hat respectfully before climbing back onto his wagon. Word spread surprisingly quickly. The widow who operated the bakery began leaving fresh bread on the porch before sunrise. A carpenter donated several sound pine boards he had stored behind his workshop. The pastor quietly delivered 2 boxes of old nails recovered from a dismantled church shed. None of them expected repayment. They simply remembered Jonathan Hale. And perhaps, though they would not yet admit it aloud, they remembered the forge itself. Each evening after finishing repairs, Martha explored another small section of the building. The old storage loft contained little more than broken wagon spokes and rusted horseshoes. The coal room held empty bins layered with decades of soot. One locked cabinet beside the workbench still contained several blacksmith's ledgers, carefully arranged exactly as Elias Turner had always kept them. Martha carried each volume into the fading afternoon sunlight before dusting its leather cover clean. Most recorded ordinary business. 1 horseshoe repaired, 2 plowshares sharpened, a wagon axle reinforced, payment accepted in cash, payment accepted in potatoes, payment accepted after harvest. Nothing remarkable. Yet those humble entries somehow moved her deeply. Each page represented trust. Entire families had relied upon those careful records because a man's word once mattered as much as his signature. Late one afternoon, Thomas Whitaker, Briar Ridge's oldest former wagon builder, slowly climbed the porch steps leaning heavily upon a walnut cane. His eyesight had weakened considerably, yet he smiled warmly upon seeing Jonathan's hammer resting once more beside the anvil. I wondered if I'd ever see that again. Martha welcomed him inside. You knew Father well. Thomas laughed softly. Knew him? Your father repaired my first wagon before I ever earned enough to pay him. Martha smiled. He never mentioned that. He wouldn't. Thomas slowly walked around the forge, pausing beside familiar tools exactly where they had rested decades earlier. Finally, his eyes settled upon the enormous chimney rising through the center of the building. Funny thing. What is? I always thought that chimney was built differently. Martha looked upward. It seems ordinary enough. Thomas shook his head. Not the inside. You've seen it? He nodded thoughtfully. When Elias built the forge, he insisted upon adding an unusually wide smoke chamber above the firebox. Why? He said strong draft kept the fire hotter. Thomas frowned slightly. But I remember arguing with him because he used nearly twice as many bricks as necessary. Martha followed his gaze toward the dark opening, disappearing high into the ceiling. Did he ever explain why? No. Thomas smiled faintly. He simply said some spaces deserved being built stronger than anyone understood. After the old wagon builder departed, Martha remained standing beneath the chimney for several long moments. The structure dominated the entire forge. Heavy hand-cut stone formed its base, while thick brickwork rose nearly 25 feet before disappearing through the roof. Decades of smoke had blackened every surface. From below, it appeared solid beyond question. Yet Thomas's casual memory quietly joined the growing collection of small mysteries surrounding the old building. The following morning, another visitor arrived. Mayor Edwin Collins removed his broad felt hat before entering. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. He slowly admired the improvements already completed. You've accomplished more in 1 week than the town managed in 20 years. Martha smiled modestly. It only needed someone willing to begin. The mayor nodded approvingly. I've brought several documents you may find useful. He handed her a bundle of folded town records tied together with blue ribbon. Old maintenance reports. Martha thanked him before carefully opening the first pages. Most described routine repairs completed during the forge's final years. A leaking roof, replacement bellows, new hinges ordered from St. Louis. Then one report immediately caught her attention. Structural inspection, April 1881. According to the notes, extensive repairs had been performed inside the chimney after an unexplained collapse damaged the upper smoke chamber. Martha looked up. I don't remember hearing about this. Mayor Collins chuckled softly. Hardly anyone does. He pointed toward the faded report. Elias supervised the repairs personally. It says the work lasted nearly 3 weeks. It did. Why? The mayor frowned. That's the strange part. The chimney wasn't actually damaged very badly. Then why did repairs take so long? I asked Elias the same question. What did he say? The mayor smiled. Some things are easier fixed while nobody's watching. Martha felt another quiet stirring of curiosity. Thomas remembered unnecessary brickwork. Now official records described weeks of mysterious chimney repairs that apparently required far more time than actual damage justified. Neither explanation fully satisfied her. After the mayor departed, she climbed a narrow ladder leading toward the loft where the chimney narrowed before passing through the roof. Dust coated every beam. Spiderwebs stretched between heavy rafters untouched for years. Using her lantern, Martha carefully examined every visible brick. Nothing seemed unusual. The mortar remained remarkably solid despite its age. She gently tapped several bricks with the wooden handle of Jonathan's hammer. Each answered with the dull, reassuring sound of solid masonry. Still, something about the chimney continued bothering her, not because she had discovered evidence, but because she had not. Every other portion of the forge reflected ordinary age. The chimney reflected extraordinary care, as though someone had invested enormous effort ensuring it survived long after everything else slowly fell apart. Heavy spring storms rolled across the mountains, forcing Martha indoors. Unable to continue repairing the roof, she decided instead to clean the firebox beneath the chimney. Years of soot, broken brick fragments, bird nests, and fallen ash filled the enormous hearth almost knee-deep. She shoveled steadily for nearly 2 hours before striking something unusually hard beneath the accumulated debris. Expecting another loose stone, she knelt for closer inspection. Her shovel had uncovered an iron cleaning hatch built low into the rear wall of the chimney. The little door measured scarcely 12 inches square. Its heavy latch remained sealed beneath thick rust. Martha brushed away decades of soot until the outline became fully visible. Above the hatch, someone had carved 3 tiny hammer marks into one brick, not random scratches, deliberate symbols. She immediately recognized them. Jonathan occasionally marked completed repairs with the same simple pattern: 3 careful strikes. His quiet way of saying the work had been finished honestly. Yet Jonathan had never built this chimney. Slowly, she forced the rusted latch open. The little iron door groaned loudly after years of silence. Inside waited only darkness. She lifted her lantern closer. The narrow passage extended upward several feet before disappearing into shadow. Ash coated every surface. Nothing appeared hidden. Still, the interior dimensions seemed unusually wide. Thomas Whitaker had remembered correctly, far wider than necessary. Martha reached one cautious arm inside. Cold brick surrounded her fingertips. Loose soot crumbled gently downward. Then her hand brushed something smooth. Not stone, not iron, wood. She withdrew her arm immediately. Her heartbeat quickened. Fetching a longer fireplace poker hanging beside the old hearth, she carefully inserted it into the hidden cavity and gently probed upward. The poker struck the wooden object once. A hollow sound echoed softly inside the chimney. Definitely wood, definitely man-made, definitely not part of the original masonry. Martha lowered the poker slowly. Someone had concealed something inside the chimney itself. Not accidentally. Deliberately. She looked up toward the soot-blackened bricks disappearing overhead. Whatever rested inside had remained undisturbed through 2 decades of abandonment, countless winter storms, and the steady passing of time. Jonathan's words quietly returned once more. Good people notice what can still be saved. Martha carefully closed the little iron hatch without disturbing anything further. Night had already settled across Briar Ridge. This discovery deserved daylight, patience, and careful hands, not hurried curiosity. As she extinguished the lantern and locked the forge behind her, neither she nor anyone else walking peacefully home beneath the evening stars could possibly imagine that hidden inside the chimney rested the one forgotten document capable of proving who had truly built Briar Ridge and who had quietly stolen it from the very people who gave the town its first heartbeat. Martha returned to the forge before sunrise, carrying a longer ladder, a coil of sturdy rope, a small mason's hammer, a lantern filled with fresh oil, and the patience both Jonathan Hale and Elias Turner had spent years teaching her. The discovery inside the chimney had occupied every thought throughout the night. She resisted the temptation to force the hidden object free in darkness because her father had often warned that haste destroyed more good work than ignorance ever could. A repair made too quickly usually becomes another repair tomorrow, he used to say. Standing once again before the soot-darkened hearth, Martha quietly repeated those words before opening the little iron cleaning hatch for the second time. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the eastern windows, illuminating tiny clouds of ash floating gently through the still air. She carefully inserted the lantern into the opening and finally saw more than darkness. Several feet above the hatch rested a narrow wooden box wedged securely between 2 specially laid rows of brick. It had not simply fallen into place over time. Someone had intentionally created a hidden chamber inside the chimney itself. The realization sent a quiet shiver through her. Whoever concealed the box had expected it to remain undiscovered for many years. Martha examined the surrounding brickwork with unusual care. One section near the rear appeared slightly different from the rest. The mortar lines remained perfectly straight, yet the bricks themselves showed almost no soot despite decades of smoke passing through the chimney. She gently tapped each brick with the wooden handle of Jonathan's hammer. Most answered with the familiar, solid sound of heavy masonry. 3 bricks near the hidden compartment produced a noticeably hollower tone. She immediately stopped tapping. Jonathan's voice echoed once again inside her memory. When something sounds different, don't force it. Ask why. Instead of removing bricks immediately, Martha climbed into the loft above the forge, where the chimney narrowed toward the roof. There she studied its construction from another angle. The upper smoke chamber widened unexpectedly, before narrowing again several feet higher. Thomas Whitaker had remembered correctly. Elias Turner had built far more space inside the chimney than proper ventilation required. Returning below, Martha carefully scraped away decades of soot around the suspicious bricks. As the black residue slowly disappeared, something unexpected emerged. Tiny chisel marks surrounded one brick, unlike the clean edges everywhere else. Someone had designed it to be removed. Very carefully, she inserted the thin blade of her putty knife into the narrow joint. The brick shifted almost immediately. Her heartbeat quickened. Within several minutes, she gently lifted it free, without damaging the surrounding mortar. Behind it lay empty space. Then another removable brick. Then a third. A hidden opening gradually revealed itself, no larger than a bread loaf. Reaching carefully inside, Martha wrapped both hands around the weathered wooden box and slowly eased it from its hiding place. It weighed considerably more than expected. She carried it carefully to the workbench beneath the nearest window, where warm morning sunlight revealed every detail. The box measured roughly 18 inches long and had been crafted from dense walnut sealed with beeswax before being wrapped in oilcloth. Though dust covered its surface, almost no moisture had reached the wood. Whoever built the hiding place understood exactly how to preserve whatever rested inside. Across the lid, someone had burned a single sentence into the walnut with careful lettering. For Briar Ridge, when honest hands return. Martha stared silently at those words. Honest hands. Jonathan had spoken similar words throughout her childhood. Elias Turner had repeated them countless times inside this very building. Taking a slow breath, she carefully loosened the brass clasp. The hinges opened smoothly despite their age. Inside rested several neatly bundled papers tied together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath them lay a folded survey map, an old leather journal, a tarnished brass key, and one sealed envelope bearing the words, "To whoever finds this." Martha reached first for the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, yet the wax seal remained remarkably intact. She carefully broke it open and unfolded several closely written pages. The handwriting belonged unmistakably to Elias Turner. "If these words are being read," the letter began, "then time has carried me beyond the reach of questions, and the forge has finally chosen another keeper worthy of its trust. My name is Elias Turner. I built this forge with my own hands in the spring of 1864. If you are reading this, then you deserve to know why I hid these papers where only patience and honest labor could uncover them." Martha felt her breath catch. She continued reading slowly. Elias explained that during Briar Ridge's earliest days, before merchants, mines, and investors arrived, the settlement existed because 32 frontier families pooled everything they owned to purchase the valley together. No wealthy company founded Briar Ridge. No railroad corporation established it. Ordinary ranchers, widows, blacksmiths, school teachers, farmers, carpenters, and wagon builders sacrificed nearly every dollar they possessed to secure land where future generations might live freely. Their agreement had been written into one extraordinary document, the original founder's deed. Unlike ordinary land deeds, it permanently reserved the Central Valley for community ownership. The school, church, public square, creek access, grazing lands, and workshop district could never legally be sold to outside corporations. They belonged forever to the people of Briar Ridge. Martha's hands trembled as she continued. Years later, after silver was discovered nearby, powerful investors quietly attempted to purchase those public lands. When the founders refused, forged copies of the deed mysteriously appeared, replacing the original. The new version erased nearly every community protection. Elias had accidentally discovered the deception while repairing a damaged courthouse cabinet where legal records had briefly been stored. Realizing certain officials already served the mining interests, he secretly removed the authentic deed before it disappeared forever. Rather than revealing it immediately and risking its destruction, he hid it inside the forge chimney until someone trustworthy could safely bring it back into the light. If greed still rules Briar Ridge, Elias wrote near the end of the letter, do not reveal these papers until you understand who profits from their disappearance. A deed alone changes nothing unless courage carries it into daylight. Tears gathered quietly in Martha's eyes. The forge had never merely repaired wagons and horseshoes. For 20 years it had guarded the very soul of the town. She carefully untied the faded ribbons surrounding the remaining documents. The first sheet bore dozens of signatures written in different hands: Jonathan Hale's father, Thomas Whitaker's father, Eleanor's father. Nearly every founding family of Briar Ridge had signed together. Attached behind the deed rested official territorial certification bearing embossed government seals, proving its authenticity beyond question. Beneath the survey map lay another surprise. A detailed ledger listed every parcel originally donated for public benefit: school grounds, river crossings, community pasture, workshop district. Even the land where Jonathan's cabin had once stood appeared marked as permanently protected against corporate purchase. Martha suddenly understood everything. Her family's property had never been legally sold because, according to the original deed, Carson Mining could never have owned that section of land in the first place. The forged records that destroyed her parents' lives had been built upon another far older fraud. She slowly looked around the quiet forge. Every scar upon the anvil, every soot-darkened brick, every weathered beam suddenly seemed to carry hidden purpose. Elias Turner had spent 3 weeks rebuilding the chimney, not because it needed repair, but because he had transformed it into the safest vault in Briar Ridge. Jonathan had never known the full truth, yet somehow he always sensed the forge protected more than iron. Martha folded every document carefully before returning them to the walnut box. She locked the lid using the little brass key found inside and carried the box beneath the workbench just as footsteps sounded outside the front door. Someone had arrived. The knock came slowly, almost politely, yet something about it immediately unsettled her. She opened the door to find 3 well-dressed men standing upon the porch. Their leader smiled pleasantly beneath an expensive black hat. "Miss Hale?" Martha nodded cautiously. "My name is Horace Bell," the stranger said. "I represent Briar Ridge Development Holdings." Martha recognized the company name immediately. It served as Carson Mining's newest land office. Bell removed a folded paper from his coat pocket. "We've heard you've accepted ownership of this old forge." "I have." He smiled again. "We're prepared to offer you $500 for the property." Martha looked calmly past him toward the chimney rising above the roof. $500 represented more money than she had seen in years. Only yesterday such an offer might have seemed impossible to refuse. Today she understood exactly why it had arrived. Someone else knew the abandoned forge was no longer worthless, and if they were willing to pay that much without even stepping inside, then whatever rested hidden within its walls frightened them far more than she had yet imagined. Horace Bell held his pleasant smile for several long seconds after making the offer, as though he expected Martha to accept immediately. $500 represented a fortune in Briar Ridge. Most families would have considered themselves wealthy with half that amount. Martha could have purchased a comfortable home, repaid every debt left behind by her parents' legal battle, and lived without fear of tomorrow for quite some time. Yet instead of looking at Bell, she quietly looked beyond him toward the soot-darkened chimney rising above the forge roof. Only that morning she had learned why Elias Turner protected the building so carefully. Only that morning she had discovered the original founder's deed hidden inside its walls. Money no longer measured the forge's value. "I'm grateful for the offer," she answered calmly. "But the forge isn't for sale." Bell's expression barely changed. "Perhaps you misunderstood." He removed another folded paper from his coat. $500, paid today." Martha smiled politely. "I understood perfectly." Bell studied her for a moment, before quietly returning the paper to his pocket. Most people don't refuse that kind of opportunity. Most people didn't grow up inside this building. Bell glanced toward the weathered structure. "It's only an abandoned forge," Martha answered gently. "Not to me." One of the younger men standing behind Belle shifted impatiently. "Mr. Bell, perhaps she simply needs time." Bell nodded slightly before replacing his black hat. "Think carefully, Miss Hale. Buildings like this become expensive to maintain." Martha met his eyes steadily. "So does a clear conscience." Belle's polite smile finally disappeared. "Good day, Miss Hale." The three men climbed back into their carriage and disappeared down the dusty road without looking back. Martha watched until they vanished beyond the cottonwood trees. Only then did she quietly lock the forge door once more before carrying the walnut box into the loft above the workshop. There, hidden beneath loose floorboards behind stacked cedar beams, she created a temporary hiding place no casual visitor would ever discover. The chimney had protected the deed for 20 years. Now another hiding place would protect it until the proper moment arrived. That evening, Thomas Whitaker returned unexpectedly. The elderly wagon builder immediately noticed concern upon Martha's face. Something happened. Martha hesitated only briefly before leading him into the forge and carefully closing the door. She did not show him the documents immediately. Instead, she described Horace Bell's visit and the sudden offer to purchase the building. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finally revealed the walnut box and placed Elias Turner's letter into his trembling hands, the old man remained completely silent while reading every page. By the time he reached the end, tears quietly rested beneath his weathered eyes. "Elias," he whispered softly, "you stubborn old friend." He carefully folded the letter again. "I always knew he was hiding something." Martha looked surprised. "You suspected?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Not what it was. Only that every time someone asked questions about old property records, Elias somehow changed the subject." He looked toward the chimney. "Now I understand why." Martha carefully unfolded the original deed across the workbench. Thomas leaned heavily upon his cane while studying the signatures. One by one, he recognized names written by men and women he had known throughout his youth. His own father's signature rested beside Jonathan Hale's father, the pastor who built the first church, the widow who donated land for the school, the carpenter who raised the original town hall. "They built this place together," Thomas murmured. "Every family gave something." Martha quietly nodded. "And someone stole it." Thomas looked thoughtfully toward the windows before speaking again. "Miss Hale, do you know why Bell came today?" "Because he somehow learned I found something." Thomas shook his head. "No." Martha frowned. "Then why?" "Because they already know this deed exists." The words settled heavily inside the silent forge. Martha stared at him. "How could they?" Thomas lowered himself slowly onto a nearby stool. "Think carefully." He pointed toward Elias's letter. "Only a handful of people ever knew the original deed disappeared." Martha slowly followed his reasoning. "Who?" "Elias Turner." "Yes, the men who forged the replacement." Martha's expression changed immediately. Thomas continued quietly. "If they never found the original, they would spend the rest of their lives wondering where Elias hid it." A long silence filled the room. Finally, Martha whispered, "So they've been searching all these years." Thomas nodded. "Perhaps not constantly." He rested one hand upon Jonathan's hammer. "But enough to recognize danger the moment someone begins restoring the only building Elias personally rebuilt." Martha suddenly remembered the unusual maintenance records, the mysterious chimney repairs, Bell's offer arriving almost immediately after she uncovered the hidden compartment. None of it had been coincidence. Someone had been watching the forge. Thomas rose carefully. "There is one more person who must see these papers." "Who?" "Judge Samuel Porter." Martha recognized the name immediately. Porter had retired from the territorial court nearly 8 years earlier and now lived quietly on a small orchard outside Briar Ridge. He had earned a reputation throughout the frontier for refusing political influence during nearly 40 years upon the bench. Jonathan often described him as one of the last truly independent judges in the territory. "Would he help us?" Martha asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "If justice still matters to anyone, it matters to Samuel Porter." The following morning, they loaded the walnut box into Thomas's modest wagon beneath several sacks of grain, carefully disguising its importance before traveling west toward the retired judge's orchard. The road wound gently through rolling hills covered with spring wildflowers. Martha remained unusually quiet throughout the journey, watching distant ranches scattered across the valley. Many families working those fields had no idea their land had once been guaranteed protection beneath the original founder's deed. Children played beside streams their grandparents legally intended to remain public forever. Entire lives had unfolded beneath a quiet deception stretching back decades. Near midday, they reached the little orchard. Judge Samuel Porter greeted them himself, despite his advanced age. Tall, silver-haired, and walking with remarkable steadiness, he welcomed Thomas warmly before noticing Martha. "Jonathan Hale's daughter," he said with gentle recognition. "You've grown into your mother's kindness." Martha smiled gratefully. Inside the modest farmhouse, they placed the walnut box upon an old oak table. Judge Porter carefully examined each document without speaking. More than an hour passed before he finally removed his spectacles. "Where did you find these?" Martha answered honestly. "Hidden inside the chimney of the abandoned forge." Porter slowly nodded. "Exactly where Elias promised they would remain." Martha looked at him in astonishment. "You knew?" The old judge sighed deeply. "Not where he hid them." He gently touched the weathered deed. "Only that he once swore to me he would protect Briar Ridge until someone better than himself could finish the task." Thomas stared across the table. "Why didn't you ask?" Porter smiled sadly. "Because the fewer people who knew, the safer the deed remained." He looked toward Martha. Elias chose well. Martha felt the weight of responsibility settle even more deeply upon her shoulders. Judge Porter stood and walked slowly toward the window, overlooking rows of blooming apple trees. "Miss Hale," he said quietly, "these papers are genuine. Can they restore what was stolen?" Porter remained silent for several moments before answering. "Yes." Hope flickered across Martha's face. Then he added softly, "But only if they survive long enough to reach the territorial court." Thomas immediately understood. "You believe someone will try to destroy them?" Porter turned back toward them. "I don't believe it." His voice carried calm certainty. "I expect it." At that exact moment, outside the farmhouse window, 3 unfamiliar riders quietly appeared upon the distant hill overlooking the orchard. They did not approach the house. They simply watched, waiting patiently beneath the afternoon sun. Judge Samuel Porter continued watching the 3 distant riders until they finally disappeared behind a line of cottonwood trees, yet neither his calm expression nor his steady voice changed. He quietly closed the farmhouse curtains before returning to the oak table, where the walnut box still rested between Martha and Thomas. "They won't act here," he said. "Not while they're uncertain whether the documents remain inside this house." Martha glanced toward the window. "Then they were watching us." Porter nodded. "Most likely from the moment Horace Bell left your forge." Thomas lowered his hat onto the table with a weary sigh. "I feared as much." Porter folded the original founder's deed with extraordinary care before placing it back inside its protective wrapping. "From this moment forward, we must assume every movement is being observed." Martha looked at the old judge. "What do we do?" Porter smiled gently. "The same thing honest people have always done." He locked the walnut box once more. "We tell the truth, but only when the truth can no longer be silenced." He walked toward an old bookcase lining the farmhouse wall and removed a leather ledger. Hidden behind it rested a narrow iron safe built directly into the stone chimney. Using a small brass key hanging around his neck, he opened the safe and carefully placed the walnut box inside. Then, to Martha's surprise, he closed the safe without locking it. Instead, he removed an entirely different wooden box of similar size and weight. "What's that?" Martha asked. Porter smiled faintly. "Insurance." Opening the second box revealed nothing more than old tax receipts, church donation records, and worn account books. "If someone steals this tonight," Porter explained, "they'll believe they've succeeded." Thomas chuckled softly, still thinking like a judge. Porter looked at him with a twinkle of quiet humor. "No." Like an old man who has lived long enough to know greed usually rushes faster than patience. Martha carefully watched every movement. "Then where will the real deed stay?" Porter closed the hidden compartment behind the bookcase once more. "Not here." Martha looked surprised. "But you just hid it." Porter smiled. "Only long enough for anyone watching to think they've seen where it belongs." He walked toward the fireplace and reached beneath the heavy stone mantel, withdrawing the genuine walnut box once again from a second concealed compartment, entirely separate from the safe. Thomas laughed aloud. "Good heavens," Porter smiled. "Courthouses taught me many things." That evening, the three of them devised a careful plan. Rather than carrying the original deed openly toward the territorial courthouse, they would separate the evidence. Judge Porter would prepare sworn legal statements confirming authenticity. Thomas would carry certified copies of Elias Turner's letter and the survey maps. Martha alone would carry the original founder's deed, hidden inside the hollow lining of Jonathan Hale's old tool chest, beneath several ordinary blacksmith's tools. No one person would possess everything. Even if one package disappeared, enough evidence would survive to expose the fraud. They agreed to leave before sunrise 2 mornings later. During the journey, Porter insisted they avoid the main road leading directly toward the county seat. "Anyone expecting us will watch the obvious route," he explained. "We'll travel through Cedar Pass instead." Martha returned alone to Briar Ridge shortly before dusk. The forge stood exactly as she had left it, yet something immediately felt wrong. The front gate remained open. She distinctly remembered fastening it that morning. Her pace slowed. Jonathan had always warned her never to ignore small changes. Small changes usually meant someone had already been there. She quietly approached the porch. At first glance, nothing appeared disturbed. The repaired shutters remained secure. The windows were intact. The door was still locked. Yet kneeling near the entrance, she noticed fresh boot prints pressed into the damp earth beneath the porch steps. Not one visitor. 3. They had circled the building carefully before leaving. Martha unlocked the forge and stepped inside. Silence greeted her. Dust floated peacefully through golden evening light, exactly as before. Jonathan's hammer rested upon the anvil. The bellows remained untouched. Yet as she crossed the workshop, her eyes settled upon the fireplace beneath the chimney. Someone had reopened the little iron cleaning hatch. Very carefully. Without forcing the rusted hinges, they knew exactly where to look. Martha knelt immediately. The hidden bricks had been removed and replaced with remarkable precision. Whoever searched the chimney understood masonry almost as well as Elias himself. They had reached the secret compartment and found it empty. A slow smile crossed Martha's face despite the danger. The hidden box now rested safely with Judge Porter. Whoever searched had arrived 1 day too late. Still, the realization troubled her deeply. Someone in Briar Ridge possessed intimate knowledge of the forge's construction. This was no random thief. This was someone who either helped build the chimney or had spent years searching for Elias Turner's hiding place. The following morning, another surprise arrived. Mayor Edwin Collins appeared, carrying an official notice bearing the town's seal. His cheerful expression disappeared the moment he saw Martha's face. "What's happened?" Martha silently led him toward the fireplace and opened the little iron hatch. The mayor studied the disturbed bricks before whispering, "Someone searched the chimney." Martha nodded. "Last night." Collins removed his hat slowly. "Then they finally realized what Elias protected." Martha looked at him carefully. "You knew too?" The mayor sighed. "Only part of it." He sat heavily upon a nearby stool. 20 years ago, Elias came to my father, who served as mayor before me." Martha listened quietly. "He asked only one thing." Collins looked toward the chimney. "If anyone ever starts asking questions about this forge, don't stop them." Martha frowned slightly. "He never explained why." Collins shook his head. "Father said, Elias looked more frightened that night than during the Great Fire of '81. He smiled sadly. "Now I understand." Martha carefully unfolded one copy of the survey map she had carried home. Collins studied it for several long moments before suddenly pointing toward one section of the valley. "This explains everything." "What?" "The community pasture." Martha looked closer. Collins continued. "Carson Mining plans to build their new processing mill there next month." Martha immediately understood. According to the original deed, that land had never belonged to the company. If construction began before the truth emerged, enormous financial losses would follow. Suddenly, Horace Bell's desperate offer made perfect sense. This was never about an abandoned forge. It was about preventing the original deed from reaching court before construction began. Collins stood abruptly. "You can't wait." Martha nodded. "We're leaving in the morning." The mayor looked directly into her eyes. Then listen carefully. His voice lowered. Don't trust every deputy wearing a badge. Martha remained silent. Collins continued. Not everyone serving the law still serves justice. Those words stayed with her long after he departed. Before dawn the following morning, Briar Ridge still slept beneath a blanket of pale blue mist as Martha quietly loaded Jonathan's old tool chest onto a small wagon borrowed from Thomas Whitaker. Inside the false bottom rested the original founder's deed, wrapped carefully inside oilcloth. Above it lay ordinary blacksmith's tools, exactly as Jonathan once arranged them. Anyone opening the chest would find nothing unusual. Judge Porter and Thomas waited several miles west, along Cedar Pass exactly as planned. Martha glanced once more toward the old forge before climbing onto the wagon seat. The soot-darkened chimney stood proudly against the brightening sky, no longer guarding the town's future because that responsibility now belonged to her. She gently touched Jonathan's hammer resting beside her on the wagon bench. "We'll finish what you and Elias began," she whispered. Then, with the first golden light of morning spilling across the frontier valley, the little wagon rolled quietly toward Cedar Pass, unaware that two riders had already slipped onto the distant ridge behind them, following at just enough distance to remain unseen. Martha never hurried the wagon, despite knowing two riders followed somewhere beyond the rolling hills behind Cedar Pass. Jonathan had taught her long ago that panic often delivered a person directly into the hands of danger, while patience quietly forced danger to reveal itself first. The little team of horses maintained a steady pace beneath towering ponderosa pines as morning sunlight slowly reached the valley floor. Thomas Whitaker waited exactly where Judge Porter had arranged, his wagon standing beside a narrow spring surrounded by smooth granite boulders. The elderly wagon builder immediately noticed Martha's expression before glancing toward the distant ridge. "They're still behind you." Martha nodded once. "Far enough to believe I haven't seen them." Judge Porter quietly climbed down from his own wagon, carrying a rolled survey map beneath one arm. "Good," he said calmly. "That means they're being cautious." Martha looked toward the old judge. "What happens if they stop being cautious?" Porter smiled faintly. "Then they make mistakes." Together they left the main trail and followed an older freight road that wound through cedar groves few travelers used anymore. Hours passed without incident. Birds filled the forest with song. Sunlight filtered through towering branches, scattering bright patches across the dusty road. The peaceful landscape almost made it difficult to believe powerful men were searching desperately for one forgotten document hidden beneath ordinary blacksmith's tools. By early afternoon they reached Miller's Crossing, a tiny settlement consisting of little more than a church, a stable, and a general store. Judge Porter suggested stopping only long enough to water the horses. As Martha filled wooden buckets beside the well, the storekeeper quietly approached her. "Miss Hale?" She turned politely. "Yes?" The elderly woman lowered her voice. "Two strangers came through, about an hour ago, asking whether anyone had seen a young woman hauling blacksmith's tools toward Pine Bluff." Martha felt no surprise, only confirmation. "What did you tell them?" The woman smiled warmly. "That most folks around here carry tools." Martha thanked her sincerely. As they prepared to leave, Thomas noticed fresh horse tracks leading away from the stable toward the eastern ridge rather than continuing along the road. "They're trying to get ahead of us," he observed. Judge Porter studied the tracks only briefly before nodding. "Exactly what I hoped." Martha looked puzzled. Porter smiled. "They still believe the papers are inside your wagon." He looked toward Thomas. "Time for the second part of the plan." Thomas climbed into his own wagon and carefully exchanged places with Martha. Jonathan's old tool chest remained exactly where it had been, but now Thomas appeared to be guarding it, while Martha rode beside Judge Porter, carrying nothing more than blankets and food supplies. From a distance, the change looked insignificant. In truth, it shifted every assumption their pursuers likely held. Late that evening, as they approached a narrow canyon leading toward Pine Bluff, 4 riders suddenly appeared across the road ahead. Horace Bell sat calmly at their center. He removed his hat respectfully as the wagon stopped. "Judge Porter," Bell said pleasantly. "Miss Hale," Porter answered without visible concern. "Mr. Bell," Bell smiled politely. "Forgive the interruption. We've received reports that valuable territorial documents may have been stolen from Briar Ridge." Martha remained silent. Bell continued. Naturally, we'd like to assist in recovering them. Judge Porter looked directly at him. Then I suggest you begin searching where they were actually stolen 20 years ago. Bell's smile faded slightly. Strong accusation. Porter answered calmly. Stronger evidence. Bell's eyes briefly shifted toward Thomas's wagon. Would you object to a brief inspection? Porter smiled almost kindly. Do you possess a warrant? Bell hesitated. No. Then I must decline. The silence stretching across the canyon became almost tangible. Finally, Bell nodded slowly. Very well. He stepped his horse aside. Safe travels. The wagons continued forward without another word. Only after the canyon disappeared behind them did Martha quietly exhale. Thomas laughed softly from the second wagon. They never looked twice. Judge Porter smiled. Because greed nearly always watches the wrong hands. They reached Pine Bluff shortly after sunrise the following morning. The territorial courthouse rose proudly above the town square, its brick walls glowing warmly beneath the early light. News of Judge Porter's arrival spread quickly. Court clerks, attorneys, and local officials greeted the retired judge with obvious respect. Within an hour, the original founder's deed, Elias Turner's sworn letter, the certified surveys, and every supporting record rested safely upon the courtroom table beneath official supervision. By noon, the courtroom overflowed with spectators from Briar Ridge and neighboring settlements. Farmers stood shoulder to shoulder beside merchants. Teachers, ministers, blacksmiths, ranchers, and railroad workers filled every available seat. Horace Bell arrived, accompanied by several attorneys representing Carson Mining, each carrying stacks of legal documents intended to defend decades of disputed ownership. Yet the atmosphere changed the moment Judge Porter rose to speak. Calmly and without theatrical flourish, he explained how Elias Turner had preserved the original founder's deed inside the forged chimney after discovering fraudulent replacements. Thomas Whitaker confirmed the mysterious chimney reconstruction 20 years earlier. Mayor Edwin Collins testified regarding his father's conversations with Elias. Finally, Martha stepped quietly before the bench, carrying Jonathan Hale's weathered hammer. She placed it gently upon the evidence table beside the original deed. My father taught me, she said softly, that broken things deserve someone willing to repair them instead of throwing them away. I thought he meant wagons and tools. She looked toward the judge. I know now he also meant truth. The courtroom remained perfectly silent. After examining every document personally, the territorial judge slowly stood. His voice carried clearly throughout the chamber. The evidence before this court establishes beyond reasonable doubt that the original founder's deed of Briar Ridge has remained authentic and legally binding since the town's creation. He paused only briefly. All subsequent transfers violating its provisions are hereby declared null and void, pending immediate correction. A quiet murmur swept through the room. The judge continued. Public lands reserved by the founders shall immediately return to community ownership. Families unlawfully removed from protected property shall have their claims restored. Construction planned upon community land shall cease effective immediately. No cheers erupted. The moment felt too sacred for celebration. Many simply bowed their heads. Others quietly reached for loved ones standing beside them. Decades of injustice had ended not through revenge, but through truth, patiently preserved by one blacksmith who believed honest hands would someday return. Carson Mining's representatives offered no dramatic protest. Their legal foundation had simply disappeared beneath them. Horace Bell quietly gathered his papers before leaving the courtroom without speaking. Within months, land wrongfully taken from dozens of families returned to its rightful owners. Martha never reclaimed the old Hale cabin because another struggling widow now lived there with 3 young children. Instead, she asked the court to let that family remain, saying her parents would have wanted the house filled with hope rather than memory. The abandoned forge became something far greater than a workshop once again. Volunteers repaired every beam, replaced every broken window, rebuilt the roof, and restored the great chimney exactly as Elias Turner had left it. The building reopened as the Briar Ridge Community Forge and Founders Hall, where young apprentices learned both blacksmithing and the history of the town, built by ordinary people working together. Inside the restored chimney, behind a small glass panel placed where the hidden compartment once existed, Visitors could see the empty space where the deed had waited patiently for 20 years. Beneath it rested a simple brass plaque bearing Elias Turner's final words, "For Briar Ridge, when honest hands return." Martha never considered herself the heroine of the story. Whenever visitors thanked her, she simply rested Jonathan's old hammer upon the anvil and smiled quietly. "I only finished the work others began," and perhaps that was the greatest lesson Briar Ridge ever learned. Communities are not saved by extraordinary people seeking glory. They are restored by ordinary people who quietly refuse to abandon what is good, even when everyone else has forgotten its worth. Long after the fires inside the forge burned brightly once again, the steady ringing of hammer against anvil echoed across the valley each morning, reminding every child growing up in Briar Ridge that the strongest foundations are never built upon wealth or power, but upon truth, faithfully protected until the day courage finally carries it back into the light.